What terrifies ye? Monsters and mermaids, krakens and sirens? Is it horror stories of sailors? Or is it the dissonance of the sea, both beautiful and terrible? Or is it the unfathomable depths, the unknown, and the unexpected? No, it's more. Something ancient and primal, a knowledge that's more vast than the sea is deep. An essence older than the heavens, a presence of malice and hate towards the gods themselves. 'Tis this, the unknowable mind, this haunting presence. It's more than just fear. It's the infinite, creeping towards the end of everything. Nothing wrought by the hands of the gods will last. The inevitable returning of the eternal mind. That's the terror that lies below. And that was a blustering buccaneer NPC
that you can add to your game to foreshadow the Aboleth Cult. I'm Brad Wolf, and this is Dire Dan. And if you're new here, one of the things I do is help you prep your campaigns, and one of the ways I do that is with building factions. And this continues Kraken Week, and special thanks again to Pointy Hat and Jenny D for organizing all of this, and special thanks to the following: Riker from the Cleric Corner, Mark from Arcane Mark, Dex Save Dan, and DM Jim from Wizards and Wordslingers. In my last video, each of them pitched me ideas and challenged me to include those in the Aboleth Cult, and that's what I did. You saw how I put all of those together into this faction that you could use in your game. And today, I'm going to give you the stat blocks for those monsters that they created. Now, one thing that's really important here is you never need to build a monster from the ground up. You never have to start from ground zero and make a fresh new stat block. You can always reskin an existing monster, make changes to an existing monster, or mix and match monster abilities. In fact, I have a whole video where I show you how to do multiple reskins or rebuilds of various monsters, and I highly recommend you check that out. It's a real time saver when it comes to DMing and how you can rebuild your monsters. Now let's check this out. This is the Bright-Eyed Cultist. This is the one that DM Jim from Wizards and Wordslingers recommended, and it's basically just a reskin of the Bard. This shows you that you could just do this at the table. There's so few changes here, and the changes are mostly, almost exclusively flavor. So to run this stat block, you can use it as is from the Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse book. However, here it is with a few tweaks that I made. And like I said, these are tweaks that you could do on the fly in most situations. So the Bright-Eyed Cultist still has an armor class of 15, but I did it by using mage armor instead of a chain shirt, because I figured that was more appropriate to our magic-y, creepy cult. The Bard stat block has acrobatics and performance, something our cultists didn't really need, so I switched those out for intimidation and insight. So the things I highlighted in blue are things that I changed, and the things highlighted in pink are things that I just did away with. The Bard stat block has this group of spells that it can cast, and I just did away with Vicious Mockery, and that's because I put Vicious Stare down here in the actions. And that's consistent with the newer design that we see in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse book. The Know to Your Destiny ability is essentially Bardic Inspiration, just reflavored for the creepy cult. And that's another helpful tip of how to upgrade your monster stat blocks, is take class abilities and reflavor them for that monster's use. Now we come down here to reactions, because I believe that all monsters should have a reaction ability, because it helps with the action economy, and once the monster uses its reaction, then players aren't locked down by potential opportunity attacks. And I'm hoping that the new monster manual we get next year, we're going to see a lot more of this kind of design. So down here, we have the reaction ability called Constructive Criticism. And this is essentially the taunt from the Bard stat block. And all I did was I reworded it as a reaction and changed the name to Constructive Criticism, because Jim said that sounded better for an HR cultist. Next, we have our Eldritch Kraken, which is a monster created by Mark from Arcane Mark. And it's essentially a Kraken that has taken on some Aboleth-like abilities. So the first thing I did was lower its armor class, and you'll see why in just a minute. And then I raised its hit points, because Eldritch Kraken sounds a lot more badass than Juvenile Kraken, which is the stat block this is based on. So I upped the CR a little bit to coincide with the cooler name. And I did away with the but can't speak part of their telepathy. So now this creature is able to communicate freely via telepathy with the Aboleth and the rest of the cult. As discussed in the last video, this Kraken has a psychic sheen to its skin. So it's taken on a thinner translucent skin like the Aboleth that pulses with psychic energy, giving it this odd, eerie glow. It actually provides it defensive capabilities, and that's why I lowered the armor class to compensate for the fact that this skin gives creatures disadvantage to hit it. Since I increased the challenge rating, I also increased the number of attacks that it has with multi-attack. It now makes 4 tentacle attacks. I also cleaned up the language on the fling ability to make it more clear and more concise. Then I moved its bite attack down to its reaction. So once the Kraken has a creature grappled with its tentacle, it can use its reaction to take the bite attack, which is really how this stat block was worded in the Ghost of Saltmarsh book, but again, it wasn't very clear. So by moving it to a reaction, it makes it much more clear and easy to use and adds to our action economy as discussed earlier. And now we have the legendary actions. I took the lightning strike from the junior Kraken's actions and moved it into the legendary actions. I also gave it a psychic drain ability, which is similar to an Aboleth ability. And then I changed its ink cloud to an abhorrent cloud. Instead of doing poison damage like the Kraken's original ability, this cloud causes the poison condition, and then anybody who is poisoned in this way also has vulnerability to psychic damage. These changes free up our action economy, because the abhorrent cloud, since it doesn't deal damage, only requires 1 legendary action to use instead of using all 3 at once. And it incentivizes the use of the psychic drain legendary action. So all of these start to work together in a way that's more fun for the DM to use instead of the original design of the Kraken. Now here we have Deck Save Dan's Cult Coven. And this is where we took 3 mermaids and made them a coven around this magic item that I ended up calling the Night Pearl. So what I did was I started with the Cult Fanatic stat block, and you can see here in the green is where I added the abilities from the mermaid stat block. I gave them the 10-foot speed with a 40-foot swim speed, and added the +2 to perception, and I gave them the amphibious trait. So this is just mashing 2 monster stat blocks together, which is very easy to do, and this becomes a merfolk cult fanatic, basically. So I called it the merfolk fanatic. Now again, you can see the changes I made highlighted here in blue. And I increased the armor class from 13 to 15, and I removed the Shield of Faith spell. My thinking here was, if all 3 of them have the Shield of Faith spell, they could each cast it on each other. Why would I leave it up for the DM to figure that out? I just took out the Shield of Faith and gave them natural armor instead of leather armor that the Cult Fanatic had, and that increased their AC up to 15. So instead of getting the +2 from Shield of Faith being cast on each other, we just set their AC at 15. The other changes I made is I gave them dark vision, because it kind of makes sense because it's dark underwater that mermaids would have dark vision, even though the mermaid stat block doesn't have dark vision. But I gave these mermaids dark vision. I also added goblin to the languages because there's goblins in the cult. And then I added Ray of Frost to the cantrip list to replace the Sacred Flame. It makes more sense to cast Ray of Frost underwater than it does Sacred Flame. So like our HR cultist, we're going for this vibe of friendly but creepy. So I gave the merfolk fanatic friends and charm person. The last thing I did was I took inflict wounds off of their spell list, and that's because I added the action ability called necrotic song. And that essentially works like inflict wounds, but it also has a ranged attack as well. And this gives them just an action where they can do necrotic damage, but it's flavored like mermaids with a song. And of course, Deck Save Dan described this idea of them having this disgusting tongue. I think he was just going for creepy, but then I combined that with their ability to pass off the magic pearl one to each other, and that's where we get the disgusting tongue reaction ability. The trigger for the reaction is when they are reduced to 0 hit points. The response, the merfolk fanatic can use its tongue to pass the cult's night pearl to another member of the cult within 30 feet. Yeah, I know, it's a really long tongue, but it's a fantasy world, whatever. And then we come down to the magic item itself, the Night Pearl, and I based this on the Eldritch Staff. There's a magic staff in the game called the Eldritch Staff. The Magic Pearl has 10 charges for the following properties. It regains 1d8 + 2 expended charges daily at dawn. Now, because Deck Save Dan specifically mentioned that this Magic Pearl should make its wielder more powerful, I gave it this Eldritch Mist ability. You can use an action to expend 1 charge to give yourself 10 temporary hit points. The Pearl's next ability is Eldritch Voice. When you deal damage to a creature while holding the Pearl, you can expend up to 3 of its charges. For each charge you expend, the target takes an extra 1d8 psychic damage. Lastly is the Eldritch Escape, which is exactly like the Eldritch Staff ability. It's a glorified Misty Step that lets you get away. Now, our last creature is a scum dragon, and this is a brass dragon that's been corrupted by the Aboleth's disease, making it a vassal of the Aboleth. So we give it that Aboleth vassal ability that comes from the scum stat block. We also give it the amphibious trait, the psychic conditioning trait, and the water dependency trait, again, from the scum stat block. Then the biggest change is doing away with the fire breath and upgrading the sleep breath to nightmare breath.
Across all games, the game mechanic that I absolutely hate is when you lose your turn. So I don't want to take a turn away from a player by making them go unconscious unnecessarily. So in the comments, tell me what you think about this Nightmare Breath ability. So what it does, instead of completely driving the character unconscious, while they're unconscious, they have to fight their nightmare. So here's the actual wording in the text. The scum dragon exhales sleep gas in a 30-foot cone. Each creature in that area must succeed on a DC 14 Constitution saving throw or fall unconscious. This effect ends for the creature if the creature takes damage from outside the nightmare, or the creature escapes the nightmare as described below. So how do you escape the nightmare? While unconscious, the creature believes it is trapped in a murky vision of their home and is attacked by a nightmarish entity. The entity uses the giant octopus stat block. If the creature reduces the giant octopus to 0 hit points, the creature wakes and the unconscious condition ends. If the creature is reduced to 0 hit points by the giant octopus, the unconscious condition ends and the creature awakens with 1 hit point. So this prevents the usual sleep condition scenario where your character falls asleep and loses its action, and then another player character has to forego their action in order to wake you back up. Instead, it's essentially like summoning another creature. However, that creature is contained in this nightmare, and the player has to fight that creature one-on-one, which shouldn't really take more than 1 or 2 turns, but instead of those turns being wasted by doing essentially nothing, you're still rolling dice and fighting a creature and freeing yourself. But to prevent this from accidentally killing a player character, there's this caveat where if you drop to 0 hit points in the nightmare, you regain consciousness with 1 hit point. This prevents you from falling into a death save situation while you're unconscious within this nightmare. I think this is a cool, unique ability. Tell me what you think, if this is game breaking in some way that I'm not seeing. I really hope you enjoyed Kraken Week as much as we did. It was so much fun as content creators, the big ones to the small ones, to be able to collaborate on all of this. I actually learned of other channels that I didn't know even existed yet. And it was just great to see everybody working together on this huge project. It was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy Kraken Week and go watch more Kraken Week videos. I'm sure there's a study that shows the more Kraken Week you watch, the happier you feel. I'm pretty sure. But thanks again for watching the Dire Den, and I'll see you next time. There's a link in the description below to my Patreon page, and all these stat blocks are there free for the public. You don't even have to be a member of my Patreon to access these stat blocks. And while you're there, please vote. There's a poll that lets you decide what you would like to do with the Dire Den Patreon.